Hello everyone! Today I would like to invite you to examine Daniel's prophetic period of 1335 days. Daniel said that from the time the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be a prophetic period, and blessed is he who waits and comes to the end of 1335 days. How are we to understand this? What events was he talking about? How is this prophecy to be fulfilled? First, we need to note that at the beginning of this time period, the abomination of desolation is set up. But it is important to see that to set up the abomination of desolation, the Antichrist commits a series of actions rather than just one. The prophet Daniel reveals that the abomination of desolation is not a separate event, but only one link in a chain of interrelated events, such as an attack on the heavenly host or the heavenly sanctuary, attack on the sacrifice or covenant, and so on. Today, many attempts to explain what the abomination of desolation means often completely omit these details of the prophecy, and thus they ignore the context. As a result, the abomination of desolation is not just made to stand out, but is taken out of context and made into an autonomous event. Its connection with the other parts of the prophecy is lost, which inevitably leads to misinterpretation. Let's examine what series of actions will lead us to the point when the abomination of desolation is set up. They are described in the chapter 8 through 12. First, Daniel says that the Antichrist would cast down some of the host of heaven in Daniel chapter 8 verse 10. Second, in the same verse, Daniel says that he would cast down some of the stars. Third, in Daniel chapter 8 verse 11, he says that he would attack the prince of the host. Fourth, Daniel continues in the same verse and says that the Antichrist would take the daily sacrifice away. Fifth, Daniel continues and says that the Antichrist would cast down the place of the sanctuary in Daniel chapter 8 verse 11. Sixth, Daniel says that the covenant would be forsaken. We read about this in Daniel chapter 11 verse 30. Seventh, the Antichrist would set an army against God. We read about this in Daniel chapter 8 verse 12 and chapter 11 verse 31. 8. Daniel says that thus the abomination of desolation would be set up. Daniel 8:13, 11:51, and 12:11. And finally, 9th, he says that it will continue for 1335 days. We read about this in Daniel chapter 12, verses 11 and 12. To understand what all these actions mean, let's examine them in detail. First, Daniel said that the host of heaven would be cast down. What does it mean? Well, we read in the Bible that the host of heaven often refers to God's faithful people, and casting down in this context means appropriating their names and reputation. This part of the prophecy was fulfilled when the church began to teach that its church buildings symbolically and literally had famous apostles and saints as their foundation. Second, Daniel also said that some of the stars would be cast down to the ground. Well, the stars in the Bible can also be used as a symbol of God's faithful people or angels. This part of the prophecy was fulfilled when in the 6th century the church began to dedicate its church buildings to angels, worship them, and assign them responsibility for different areas. Third, the prophet said that the Antichrist would exalt himself as high as the prince of the host. Since the whole context speaks about the sanctuary, the prince of the host should be understood as a reference to the high priest. Sure enough, the church began to teach that its head is the high priest. Thus, this part of the prophecy was also fulfilled. Fourth, we read that by him the daily sacrifice would be taken away. The daily sacrifices, or as some translations simply say, the daily, are to be understood as the sacrifice of Jesus and his ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. Taken away means that someone else would claim to be doing this ministry. When we study church history and its liturgy, we can clearly see how this was fulfilled when the church began to teach that the Eucharist is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and that a church priest takes Christ's place. Fifth, we also learn that the place of his sanctuary would be cast down. As we already know, casting down in this context means appropriating titles. In this case, the prophecy says that the title of God's sanctuary would be used illegitimately. This part of the prophecy was also fulfilled when the church began to teach that its building is the temple of God on earth. 6. The prophet said that the covenant with God would be forsaken. When Jesus gave his disciples the cup, he said, "This cup was the cup of his covenant." He instituted the ordinance of the Lord's Supper in remembrance of him, and not as his ongoing or continuing sacrifice, as the Church teaches about the Eucharist today. By departing from remembrance and turning to the unbloody sacrifices of Jesus in the Eucharist, the Church fulfilled this part of the prophecy and forsook the cup of the covenant. 7th, we also read that the Antichrist would set up an army against God. This means that the Antichrist would not be alone. He would have many soldiers or an army. This war is not physical, but spiritual and religious. And the center of the attack is the high priest and his sanctuary. That also means that the soldiers are also spiritual soldiers, the army of priests who take the title of Jesus, and thus they replace him and his heavenly ministry. This all fulfills this part of the prophecy. 8th, when all the above actions come together, then the abomination of desolation will be set up. According to the Bible, any contact with a dead body would defile the sanctuary and make it abominable. Yet, relics or the remains of dead bodies had become an integral part of church temples. They were placed under the altar or in the so-called most holy, consecrating the Eucharist, the altar, and the temple. All this reminds us about the defilement of the sanctuary and about the abomination. 9th, finally, we read that these blasphemous teachings would continue without interruption for 1335 prophetic days, or for 1335 literal years. We learn from Caesar Baronius, librarian of the Vatican Library, that the Council of Pound in 509 AD declared that relics should be placed in the altar part of church buildings. Exactly 1335 years later, in 1844, these blasphemous teachings were challenged by revival, and the message about Jesus' soon second coming and his ministry in the heavenly sanctuary, not in earthly sanctuary. In conclusion, I would like to add, it would be unfair to understand the abomination of desolation only as relics. The Bible calls all aspects of idolatry as an abomination. Thus, our conclusion should be that the abomination of desolation is a non-biblical or idolatrous form of worship in church. It is a deviation and the totality of all the actions described above. Relics here are only the cherry on top, but the full picture of the abomination of desolation can be seen in the worship of the Eucharist. Stay with me for the next video.